So, now I wanted to take you through a hypothetical example about a case study with a hypothetical client, Mr. and Mrs. X, about how we would go about building out a hypothetical property portfolio that was going to allow them to achieve the net wealth that is required to achieve the passive income that Mr. and Mrs. X need in order to live the lifestyle that they deserve. Before I get into this example is a hypothetical situation and it does not constitute advice and is for educational purposes. And also, if you'd like to go through a free 2-hour strategic property portfolio planning session that's catered towards your personal situation, I'm happy to arrange for that. Again, it's completely free of charge and obligation free. So if you want to learn a little bit more and go into a little bit more detail, be very happy to invest that time with you. And I encourage you to ask yourself the question when considering this, what have you got to lose? It's completely free. So with that being said, let's get into Mr. and Mrs. X's situation. So after having a chat with Mr. and Mrs. X, and I tried to make this example as generic and as average and as relatable as possible to give you an indication of what might be possible in terms of your situation, we're going to assume that Mr. X is earning about $90,000 a year, Mrs. X about $35,000. They do own their own home in Sydney, and the home value currently is about $750,000, and they owe about $485,000 on that loan. So there's a little bit of equity there from the recent Sydney property boom that's they can potentially use, as well as they have a little bit of savings there, around about $30,000, which they can use to combine with their equity in order to potentially use as a deposit for their very first investment property. So I think you might agree that that's a fairly, let's call it vanilla set of circumstances there that could apply to a lot of couples out there. Is begin with the end in mind. So I would spend some time working out the kinds of lifestyle that they want to live in at some stage in the future. And this is quite an involved process, and it's going to be very unique to everyone. So again, if you want to go through this process, which is so important because this part and this discussion is what's going to hold you into your investment journey when you do face roadblocks and allow you to overcome them in order to achieve your long-term dreams. But in Mr. and Mrs. X's case, without going through their personal dreams, they've come up with a figure of $2,000 a week, or roughly $100,000 a year in passive income they want to live on, and they've given me a goal to achieve this within 15 years. Now, the first question I'm going to ask Mr. and Mrs. X is, this $2,000 a week that you want to live on, is that in today's dollars or 15 years' time dollars? And what I'm getting at here is that in 15 years' time, $2,000 is going to buy you a lot less than $2,000 buys you today. So, obviously I'm talking about inflation here. So all of our calculations are actually adjusted for inflation. So essentially they want $2,000 worth of purchasing power in 15 years' time. The second assumption that you see here is we assume that their net wealth or net portfolio in this case is able to achieve a 5% return. This is a very conservative number. It's not necessarily related to the property market. Essentially, the message I try to give Mr. and Mrs. X is, in order to achieve $100,000 or $2,000 a week, they need a net asset pool in 15 years' time of around about $3.2 million. Now, there are other ways to build this kind of net asset pool. I mean, one way is some people think that they can save their way to financial freedom. And Mr. and Mrs. X realize that there is no possible way that they're going to be able to save $174,000 a year. Obviously, that's even more than they earn, even if they didn't have to pay tax or have any expenses whatsoever. Some people can do it through investing in shares. Recently, I was discussing with a group of accountants, and even they acknowledge that in terms of building assets, although some people do very well and grow their assets very quickly through investing in shares, 98% of property investors, if they hold for the long term, are successful, whereas only 2% of share investors over the long term are successful. So for the vast majority of us, investing in property is the only way that we're going to be able to build the kind of asset pool that we need, the net asset pool, in order to deliver us the passive income that we deserve in our retirement. So now Mr. and Mrs. X understand that they need to do something, they need to invest in property, and they need to take action quickly, because the longer they wait, the further out this 15 years is for them, and the older they're going to be. So it obviously starts with the first investment property. So in this case, we're going to assume that we purchase an investment property valued at around about $500,000. And we're going to take a very conservative standpoint and assume that it takes about 12 years for this particular property to double, which is above the average market rate over the last 20 years in the eastern capital cities. So what you can see here is once we plug in the 500,000 and the 12 years to double, you can see if we buy the property today, in 1 year it's worth a little bit more, in 2 years it's worth a little bit more, all the way down to about 20 years where it's worth about $1.5 million. Now, as we've already covered in this course, it's very unlikely that the growth rate of this particular property is going to be as smooth as we predict. We assume an average growth rate. However, it may stay flat for the first 4 years and then absolutely explode for the next 3 or 4 years and then slow down. It's going to vary depending on situation to situation. But over time, we assume that the property goes up in value on average at a rate of about 6% per annum, taking it 12 years to double. Now, after they purchase their first property, through some combination of savings as well as equity, because we get up to year number 3 here, and we can see that the property we bought is worth $594,000. So we potentially only owe maybe $400,000. So we've got a little bit of equity that we can take out of property number 1 and combine it with any savings or inheritance or any other sources of funds to use as a deposit for property number 2. Now, the question I want you to ask yourselves as you're going through this scenario is, if we fast forward time to property number 3, we had to wait 3 years for property number 1 to grow in value enough for it to allow us to build up a deposit to buy property number 2. But for property number 3, are we going to have to wait 3 years, or are we going to have to wait longer or less? Now, for those of you that answered less, you're 100% right. Now, the reason for this is, and for all of you there thinking about, yes, but what about the banks and serviceability? Of course, this takes into that comes into account, and how their incomes have grown, and a whole raft of variety of other factors. But what we're looking to exemplify here is the fundamental strategy about how we help our clients to build a property portfolio. Things like serviceability criteria, etc., that we're experiencing at the moment, the banks clamping down on, are always cyclical in nature, and it's very hard to predict 6 months into the future, let alone 5, 10, 15 years. So property number 3 can come faster because we now have property number 1 and property number 2 going up in value, meaning that our equity or net worth is growing at a faster rate. So hypothetically, in this scenario, maybe after about 2 years, we can invest in property number 3. And as you might have guessed, property number 4, because now we have 3 properties going up in value, will come potentially even faster. So this is how we go about building a property portfolio or a plan for our clients. However, I just want to be very clear here. The reason that we don't go into absolute detail with our clients talking about holding cost and serviceability and all these other variable factors is ask yourself the question, 10 years ago, did you know where you were going to be today? How can we possibly predict? Life is so unpredictable. There's so many variables that could potentially change. But what we want our clients to understand is the fundamental theory about how we go about building a property portfolio. And as strategists, that we work together with them over the long term to adjust the next step towards their current circumstances. So what's the result in this case after 20 years? Well, after 15 years, because that's our target. Well, as we can see, if we assume that it's going to double every 12 years, after 15 years, we haven't quite achieved our $3.2 million target. In fact, we're about $1 million short. Now, Mr. and Mrs. X have two choices at this point. They can either, number one, wait a bit longer and get to their $3.2 million. So I would ask them at this point, hey, if it took you 17 or 18 years instead of 15 years to achieve the passive income that you've decided you deserve in your retirement, would you be disappointed? The answer is very likely to be a no. However, the other thing that we might be able to do is to play around with some numbers. So what if, instead of being ultra conservative, we assume that the investments that Mr. and Mrs. X choose are simply average of what Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane across houses and apartments have done over the last 20 years and doubling every 10 years on average. Our capital growth rate in that scenario would be 7.18%, and after 15 years, you can see that they're pretty much at their target of net equity. Yes, there's going to be some holding costs, etc., but what they need to realize is how else are they going to be able to save up or achieve by any other means $3 million worth of net equity. So now we've achieved their goal in this